All right, let's get right into it. We're going to unpack one of the most famous, most influential, and honestly, one of the most unsettling experiments in the entire history of psychology. I'm talking about Stanley Milgram's study on obedience. And trust me, it's a study that really forces us to look in the mirror and ask some pretty tough questions about who we are.
And it all starts with this one single question. I was just following orders. You've probably heard that phrase before. It was the defense used over and over again by Nazi war criminals at the Nuremberg trials. It's a really chilling idea, and it's what got the psychologist Stanley Milgram thinking, could an ordinary person, someone like you or me, do terrible things just because someone in a lab coat told them to? That's exactly what he wanted to find out.
So to really get the why behind this whole thing, we've got to rewind to the time right after the Holocaust. The entire world was trying to figure out how something so awful could even happen. And that led to this one theory, a theory that was, in a way, kind of comforting.
People landed on this idea, what psychologists call a dispositional explanation. The thinking was that there must have been something fundamentally different about the German people, some kind of unique personality flaw that made them blindly obedient. It was a way to put the horror in a box, to say, that was them, that's not us.
But Milgram, who was actually born to a Jewish family, he just wasn't buying it. He came up with a different idea, what's called a situational explanation. He basically said, hold on, what if it's not about the person? What if it's about the situation you put them in? His big hypothesis was this. Could the right circumstances, the right pressures, push almost anyone to obey orders that go against their own conscience?
So how do you even test a question like that? Well, Milgram came up with a really clever and pretty deceptive experiment. Let's break down exactly how he set this all up.
Okay, so the whole thing went down at Yale University, which right away gives it this feeling of legitimacy. You had three main players. First, the experimenter, an actor in a stern-looking lab coat. He's the authority figure. Then you had the learner, another actor, a guy named Mr. Wallace who was totally in on the secret. And finally, the teacher. And that was the only person who was a real participant, just one of 40 regular guys who answered a newspaper ad for what they thought was a study on memory and learning.
And this setup here is absolutely key. You can see the teacher and the experimenter are in one room, but the learner is in a totally different room, supposedly hooked up to electrodes. That separation wasn't an accident. Milgram knew it would create a kind of psychological distance. I mean, it's a lot easier to do something when you don't have to look the other person in the eye.
The procedure itself seemed pretty straightforward. First, there was a rigged drawing, so the real participant always ended up as the teacher. Their job was to read a list of word pairs to the learner. And here's the kicker. Every time the learner got an answer wrong, the teacher was told to give him an electric shock and to increase the voltage by 15 volts for every single mistake. Now this machine, the shock generator, it was a work of art, psychologically speaking. Look at it. There are 30 switches and they have these labels designed to build anxiety. It starts with slight shock, but it goes all the way up through danger, severe shock, and ends with this ominous XXX at 450 volts. And to make it all feel completely real, every participant got a little sample shock of 45 volts themselves. Of course, there were no real shocks. But the teacher didn't know that, and as the voltage went up, they started hearing these pre-recorded reactions from the learner. It started with little grunts, but at 150 volts, the guy is yelling about his heart condition. By 300 volts, you can hear him desperately pounding on the wall. And then, after 330 volts, just silence. Imagine being the person flipping those switches. Now, whenever the teacher hesitated or wanted to stop, the experimenter would step in with one of 4 standardized lines, what he called prods. They'd start with, "Please continue," and get firmer all the way up to this one. The critical thing here is that these weren't suggestions, and they weren't threats. They were commands, framed as being vital for the experiment to succeed. So before he even ran the study, Milgram actually polled a bunch of psychiatrists and students and asked them what they thought would happen. And let's just say their predictions could not have been more wrong. The experts predicted that almost no one would go all the way. They figured only the most sadistic, tiny fraction of the population, like 0.1%, would flip that final 450-volt switch. They thought for sure that most people would stop the second the learner started complaining about pain. But that is not what happened, not even close. 65%. Just let that number sink in for a second. Almost 2/3 of the participants, these regular guys from off the street, obeyed the experimenter and went all the way to the end, delivering what they believed was a potentially lethal 450-volt shock to a total stranger. This table shows you where people finally decided to stop. But the most shocking part is actually what's not on here. 100% of the participants, every single one, continued all the way to 300 volts. That's the point where the learner was pounding on the wall. Even after that, 26 out of the 40 participants went all the way to the very end of the board.
But here's the thing, this obedience wasn't easy. The numbers don't show the whole picture. These people weren't psychopaths. They were in agony. They were sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips. Some of them broke into this bizarre, nervous laughter. They were clearly caught in this terrible conflict between what their conscience was screaming at them and what the authority figure was demanding.
So this leads to the next big question, right? What was it about this situation that made people behave this way? To figure that out, Milgram ran a whole bunch of variations of the experiment to see what would happen if he changed things up.
And this chart just makes it crystal clear. When the experimenter wasn't in the room and was just giving orders over the phone, obedience dropped way down to about 20%. And get this, when the participant had some backup, when 2 other teachers in the room refused to go on, obedience absolutely plummeted to just 10%. This was the proof for Milgram's hypothesis. It's not just about who you are, it's about where you are and who's with you.
So to explain what was happening in their heads, Milgram came up with his agency theory. He argued that when we're faced with what we see as a legitimate authority, we can flip into this different mental state, an agentic state. In this state, we stop seeing ourselves as responsible for our actions. We see ourselves as just an instrument, an agent, carrying out someone else's orders. The participants basically handed over the moral responsibility to the guy in the lab coat.
So the findings were absolutely world-changing. But the way Milgram got those findings, well, that kicked off an ethical firestorm that literally changed the rules of psychology forever.
I mean, just look at this list. The participants were completely lied to about what the study was for, so they couldn't really give informed consent. They were put under incredible psychological stress. And those verbal prods, they made it really, really hard for people to feel like they actually had the right to get up and walk out. By any modern standard, this study is a textbook example of what not to do. But, and this is a really important but, all that controversy and backlash led to something incredibly positive. The outcry over what happened to these participants directly led to the creation of institutional review boards, or IRBs. These are basically ethics committees that have to approve research now, and because of them, an experiment like Milgram's would never, ever be allowed to happen again. So yeah, Milgram's experiment is a thing of the past. It's a snapshot from a different time in science. But the lessons it taught us about authority, and about ourselves, are as important today as they were back then. It really makes you wonder, if the situation was right, if the authority figure seemed legitimate, what would you do?